I hope she was worth it. His wife left after discovering his affair, but she took something he could never get back. Lucian Vale checked his watch
phải đi
twice
thôi,
during
em
the
yêu.
wedding ceremony.
Đừng,
Not
anh ấy
once,
cần biết
twice.
sự thật.
Vivienne saw it both times. She told herself he was nervous. She told herself powerful men carried the weight of their empires even on the happiest days of their lives. She told herself a lot of things standing at that altar, because the alternative, that the man sliding a ring onto her finger was already somewhere else in his mind, was too devastating to hold. She was 51 years old. She had buried her first husband, raised a daughter alone, and spent 9 years believing that love was simply not something the universe intended to give her twice. Then Lucian Vale walked into her life at a gallery opening in Cambridge, looked at a painting she had restored with his full attention, and said, "You gave this thing back its dignity." She fell in love with the way he noticed things. She didn't know, standing at that altar, that she was the only thing in that room he wasn't really seeing. If you've ever loved someone who is only pretending stay with me, because what Vivienne does next will change the way you think about strength. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like if you're already feeling something, and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The bridal suite at the Fairmont Copley Plaza cost $4,000 a night. Vivienne knew this because she had chosen it herself, because Lucien told her to choose whatever she wanted. That money was not a consideration, that this was her day and she deserved everything that came with it. She had felt almost guilty selecting it. She was not a woman accustomed to extravagance. She had spent most of her adult life being careful, calculating, stretching what she had, because there was never quite enough. Even now, even after 2 years with a man whose net worth she couldn't fully comprehend, she still checked price tags, still hesitated at restaurant menus, still felt a small pull of discomfort when spending felt indulgent rather than earned. So she had chosen the suite, and she had felt the guilt, and Lucien had kissed her on the cheek and said, "Perfect choice," without even looking at the photographs she showed him. She thought about that now. 4 hours and 22 minutes after the ceremony ended, she sat on the edge of the bed in her wedding gown ivory silk, hand-fitted, the most beautiful thing she had ever worn, and stared at the untouched champagne on the nightstand. The roses the hotel had arranged in 3 separate vases were beginning to lean. The ice in the bucket had melted to water. The suite was very quiet and very expensive and completely empty except for her. Lucien had said he needed an hour. Something came up with Gideon. 1 hour, Viv, I promise. He had kissed her scorn force this time, and he had gone. That was 4 hours ago. Vivienne was not a woman who panicked easily. She had learned, through years of experience, that panic was a luxury for people with backup plans, and she had rarely had those. So she sat with the discomfort the way she had learned to sit with most difficult things, quietly and without looking away from it. She had tried his phone 3 times. It rang through twice and went directly to voicemail once. She had sent 2 messages. Both showed delivered. Neither showed read. She told herself there was an explanation. There was always an explanation with Lucien. She got up carefully, because the gown was fitted, and she didn't want to damage it, and walked to the window. Boston's skyline at midnight was genuinely beautiful. She had lived in this city for 23 years, and it still did this to her sometimes, this unexpected swell of feeling when the light hit the water at exactly the right angle. She pressed one hand against the cool glass and looked out and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had no idea what her marriage actually was. Not the version in her head, not the version Lucien had described to her over dinners and late walks, and that one weekend in Vermont, when he'd told her she was the first woman in 30 years who made him feel like he didn't need to perform. She meant the real version, the version that existed in the spaces between what he said and what he actually did. She had noticed things. Of course she had noticed things. She was a woman who made her living noticing things. Restoring paintings required you to see what other people's eyes slid past, to identify the place where the original intention had been compromised, to understand the difference between damage that had occurred accidentally and damage that had been deliberately concealed. She had not become the kind of restorer she was by being careless with her observations. But she had been careless with this one. She walked back toward the bed, and that's when she saw it. Lucian's tablet, tucked between the pillow and the headboard, screen faintly glowing. He must have set it down when he came to get his jacket before leaving. He was always setting things down in a hurry: keys, glasses, his phone when he didn't want to be reachable, and she was always finding them. She had become, without fully registering it, a woman who tracked the objects her husband left behind. Picked it up. She was going to set it on the nightstand. That was genuinely what she intended. But the screen didn't lock when she lifted it, and the message thread was already open, and the name at the top was Serena with no last name, and the most recent message, sent at 11:48 p.m. read, "I missed you tonight. The suite is exactly what I imagined." Vivian stood very still. Her body understood something before her mind did. She felt it in her hands first, a faint tremor, barely noticeable, the kind she sometimes got when she was working under intense magnification for too many hours. Then in her chest, a tightening that was not quite pain, but lived right next to it. Scrolled up. She told herself she wouldn't. She told herself she should put the tablet down, call Lucian, wait for him to come back and explain. She told herself a lot of things in those first 5 seconds. Then she scrolled up anyway, because she had never in her life been the kind of woman who could choose comfortable ignorance over inconvenient truth, and she was not going to start now. The thread went back 4 years. 4 years. Vivienne sat down on the edge of the bed without meaning to. Her legs simply made the decision independently of the rest of her. She read slowly, even though reading slowly was painful. She read the way she approached damaged work, with patience, without flinching, with a determination to understand the full scope of what she was dealing with before she decided what to do about it. The woman's name was Serena Voss. She was 43. She worked in private equity, something she mentioned almost apologetically in several early messages, as though she expected Lucian to find this unimpressive. He didn't. Their early conversations had the quality of two people discovering a shared frequency, quick, sharp, full of the kind of shorthand that develops between people who are paying each other the particular attention that new attraction produces. Vivienne recognized it because she had experienced it herself with Lucian in the beginning. She kept scrolling. She found hotel reservations. 4 of them in the past 18 months. 3 Stasanen. 1 in New York, when Lucian had told her he was attending a conference on commercial real estate development. She found photographs, nothing explicit. She had braced herself for worse, but intimate in a way that was somehow harder than explicit would have been. Serena in a restaurant Vivienne had asked Lucien to take her to and been told he didn't enjoy that part of the city. Lucian with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, laughing at something. Completely relaxed in a way he had stopped being with Vivienne, somewhere around their 8th month together, and she had attributed it to stress, to his work, to the natural settling that happened in every long relationship. She had attributed it to everything except the truth. Then she found the message. It was from 14 months ago. Serena had apparently asked something. The message she was responding to had been deleted, and Lucian's reply read, "Don't overthink it. The marriage is a strategy. Ashcombe connections are exactly what I need right now, with the scrutiny we're dealing with. 2 years, maybe 3. Then we figure out something different. You're not losing me. You were never in danger of losing me." Vivienne read it twice. Then she set the tablet down on the nightstand, with a steadiness that cost her more than anything she had done in years. And she looked at the window, and she sat with that sentence. The marriage is a strategy, the way she had learned to sit with the first moment of understanding what a damaged painting actually needed. She did not scream, she did not cry. She was 51 years old, and she had survived things that would have broken other people, and she understood, with absolute clarity in that moment, that screaming would spend energy she was going to need for something else entirely. She thought, what kind of woman do I walk out of this room as? She thought about it for 6 full minutes. Then she reached for her own phone. Elise Navarro had been Vivienne's closest friend for 19 years, which meant she had answered the phone at genuinely terrible hours before. But when her phone rang at 12:47 a.m. and she saw Vivienne's name, she had a specific, cold feeling that this was different from the other times. "Viv, I need you to be awake," Vivienne said. Her voice was completely level. That was the thing that told Elise everything. Vivienne's voice went level when she was in the part of a crisis that came before the breaking. The part where the mind was still managing the information and hadn't yet let it through all the way. "I'm awake. I'm at the Fairmont. I need you to call Mara Reyes. Elise sat up. What happened? The marriage was a strategy. A pause. His words. I found them on his tablet. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. I'll call Mara, Elise said. Don't touch anything in that room. I'm not going to do anything stupid, Elise. I know you're not. I'm coming. Vivian looked at the tablet on the nightstand. Don't, not tonight. Tonight I just need Mara's number and I need to think. Another pause longer. He gave me access to everything, Elise. He put me on the accounts because the investigators were starting to look at him, and he needed the marriage to appear legitimate. He handed me the keys, and he never once imagined I would use them. There was another silence, different from the first one. Vivian, I'm not going to destroy him, she said carefully. I'm going to build an exit. There's a difference. Elise exhaled. I'll text you Mara's number. Call me if anything changes. It already changed, Vivian said. Everything already changed. She ended the call and sat back. Outside, Boston went on being Boston indifferent, complicated, beautiful. Somewhere below her, the city was full of people having completely ordinary midnights, and she envied them briefly and completely, the way you envy the particular piece of people who don't yet know what you know. Then she opened her contacts and started a new message to a number she didn't have yet, and she waited. Dr. Mara Reyes called back at 1:15 a.m., which told Vivian something important about the kind of professional Mara was, not the kind who waited until morning to return calls from Elise Navarro. Elise says you need forensic financial work. Her voice was businesslike without being cold. She also says it's urgent and sensitive, and that you're probably the most composed person she knows, which from Elise is saying something. She's generous. She's accurate, from what I can tell in the first 30 seconds. A brief pause. Tell me what you're working with, Vivian told her. She laid it out methodically, the joint accounts, the corporate access, the investment vehicles her husband had, added her name to in the past 4 months as the federal scrutiny around his business interests had increased. She described what she had observed in the documentation she had access to. She was careful and specific and did not editorialize. Mara was quiet throughout. When Vivian finished, she said, he added you to all of this deliberately, to make the marriage appear stable and legitimate to investigators. Yes, and he never told you what you were actually looking at. He told me enough to make me feel included without knowing anything that would make me dangerous. A very clean summary. I've been sitting with it for an hour, Vivian said. I've had time to get to the clean version. How much do you want to take? I want to take enough to be free, Vivian said. I don't want to be vindictive. Vindictive requires ongoing attention to the person you're punishing, and I have no interest in spending the next several years of my life in his orbit. She paused. I want to take what I'm legally entitled to, and I want to take certain information that I think has more value than money. And I want to do both of those things before he realizes what I'm doing. There was a longer silence from Mara's end. You understand, Mara said slowly, that if you move funds too aggressively, monitoring systems will flag it. Yes, and that you have a window of maybe 5 to 6 days before he notices something is wrong and locks you out. I know. And you're going to keep acting normally for 5 days while we do this. I kept acting normally for 2 years, Vivienne said. 5 days is manageable. Another pause. When can you be at my office? First thing tomorrow, Vivienne said. Whatever first thing means to you. 7 a.m. I'll be there. She ended the call. The tablet was still sitting on the nightstand. She looked at it for a long moment, then picked it up and plugged it into Lucian's charging cable beside the bed and set it back exactly where she'd found it, same angle, same distance from the pillow. She adjusted it twice until she was confident. Then she went to the bathroom and took off her makeup with the small travel kit she'd brought, because she had never been a woman who slept in her makeup even on the most difficult nights, and she was not going to start now. She was 51 years old. She had survived her first husband's death and 2 years of grief so heavy she'd stopped eating properly for 4 months. She had raised her daughter alone. She had rebuilt her career from a part-time adjunct position to one of the most respected art restoration practices in New England. She had done all of that without anyone handing her anything. Lucian Vale thought he had married a woman who would stay grateful and quiet and useful. He had made an interesting miscalculation. Lucian came back at 2:40 a.m. She heard the key card, The soft mechanical click of the door, the deliberate quietness of a man who expected his wife to be asleep and was managing his entrance accordingly. She lay still in the darkness with her eyes open, breathing at the rate of someone sleeping, and listened to him move through the suite. He went to the bathroom. She heard water running. He came out and she heard the specific sound of him picking up the tablet from the nightstand, and she felt her own heartbeat in her throat, felt the 2 or 3 seconds while he would have checked the screen, and then heard him set it back down. He got into bed beside her, with the careful deliberateness of a man, with practice at this particular maneuver. Viv. Very quiet, testing. She kept her breathing even. Beat of silence. Then he settled. Within 10 minutes, he was asleep. She knew the specific rhythm of his sleeping breath after 2 years. She lay beside him in the dark and thought about Serena Voss's message. I missed you tonight. The suite is exactly what I imagined. And she thought about the word strategy. And she thought about the fact that the man sleeping 18 inches away from her had built their entire relationship as a management problem. She did not feel rage exactly. Rage was too simple and too hot for what she was feeling. What she felt was something colder and more architectural, the specific sensation of understanding the true structure of something you thought you knew, finding the load-bearing walls, mapping the points of greatest vulnerability. She was an art restorer. She understood damaged structures. She understood exactly where to apply pressure. The next morning was a Tuesday. Vivienne was up at 6:10. Dressed and out of the suite before Lucian's alarm went off at 6:45. She left a note on the bathroom counter breakfast with Elise. Be back by noon, specific enough to be plausible, vague enough not to be verifiable. She had been leaving notes like this throughout their relationship, and had never once had him question one. She thought about that on the drive to Mara's office. The notes. The small lies of omission she'd engaged in throughout their relationship. Not dishonest ones, just the ordinary private spaces that anyone in a long relationship maintained, and how he had never questioned a single one. Because he wasn't paying attention. Because she was furniture, useful and pleasing, and essentially static, and furniture didn't require monitoring. Mara Treyas worked out of a 4th-floor office in the financial district, the kind of space that communicated competence without advertising it. She was perhaps 45, with the particular quality of stillness that Vivienne associated with people who had spent years listening to difficult things without being destabilized by them. She had coffee waiting and a yellow legal pad covered in preliminary notes. I started last night after we talked, she said. I wanted to understand the shape of what we're working with before you arrived. What did you find? Mara looked at her steadily. Your husband is a very careful man who made one significant mistake. He underestimated me. He underestimated what legitimate access actually means. Mara turned the legal pad. There are 11 accounts you have joint control over. 3 of them are straightforward personal banking, household, 1 investment fund he set up in both names when you got engaged. The other 8 are more interesting. Vivienne leaned forward. Those 8 are connected to corporate structures, holding companies, real estate entities, a couple of investment vehicles that move money between his legitimate operations and what looks, from the outside, like very aggressive tax optimization. Mara paused. And possibly some things that aren't tax optimization. How possibly, significantly possibly, Mara held her gaze. I want to be clear about something before we go further. I'm a forensic financial specialist. My job is to document and analyze. What you do with what I find, that's your decision. I'm not going to steer you toward any particular outcome. Stand. Some of what's here could be of interest to federal investigators. I'm not telling you to take it there. I'm telling you that the option exists, and that if you choose it, there are specific ways to do it that protect you, and specific ways that expose you. Vivienne looked at the legal pad. How long do we have? 5 days if we're careful. Possibly 6. The monitoring on 3 of the accounts is human, not automated. Sumsion reviews transactions weekly, and the review day appears to be Monday. So we have until next Sunday night. 5 days. Vivienne did the calculation. Today was Tuesday. What do we do first? We document everything, Mara said. Before we move a single dollar, we photograph, copy, and secure every record you have access to. Because the records are actually more valuable than the money. Vivienne understood immediately. They tell the story. They tell a very specific story, Mara agreed. About shell companies, about money flows, about certain relationships your husband has with people who would prefer those relationships to remain undocumented. The room was very quiet for a moment. All right, Vivienne said. Show me where to start. She was back at the hotel by 11:40 a.m. Lucian was in the sitting room with his laptop, on a call, jacket off, the way he always was by mid-morning. He looked up when she came in and covered the phone briefly. Good breakfast? Elise sends her love, Vivienne said. He went back to his call. She went to change into something more comfortable and thought about how easy it was, this performance. She had been performing for 2 years without knowing she was performing, which meant she had already developed the muscle. Now she just needed to use it consciously. She thought, I can do this. She thought, I have to. She came back out in jeans and a light sweater and sat across from him with a book she'd been meaning to read for 3 months, and she read 6 pages without absorbing a single sentence. And when he finished his call, he reached across and touched her hand and said, I'm sorry about last night. She looked up. Something came up with Gideon that couldn't wait, he said. I should have been more present for you. The word present almost made her laugh. The specific, unconscious irony of it from a man whose mind had been somewhere else since before the ceremony. It's all right, she said. He squeezed her hand. You're good at being understanding. I'm good at watching and waiting, she thought. You've been confusing those things since the beginning. You don't have to make it up to me, she said. He smiled. The smile that she had fallen in love with, that she still, infuriatingly, recognized as genuinely warm. He was not a man without warmth, which made it worse, not better. He had warmth, and he had chosen not to spend it on her. Dinner tonight? He offered. Anywhere you want. Surprise me, Vivienne said. He went back to his laptop. She went back to her book. They sat together in a suite that cost $4,000 a night, in the ruins of a marriage that had never been what she thought it was, and it looked, from the outside, completely ordinary. The days had a strange texture to them. She and Mara worked in 2-hour windows, early mornings before Lucian was awake, or in the gaps when he had meetings she wasn't expected to attend. She documented, she copied. She created the kind of careful, organized archive that her restoration work had trained her to build cross-referenced, complete, nothing overlooked. Mara guided her through the financial structures with the patience of someone explaining a complicated painting to a non-specialist, though Vivienne turned out to need less explaining than Mara expected. You learn fast, Mara said on the 3rd morning. I've been married to this for 2 years, Vivienne said. I just didn't know I was studying. The money required more delicacy. They were not reckless. They moved carefully in amounts below monitoring thresholds through transfer pathways that Mara had mapped in advance. It was not quick and it was not satisfying in any dramatic way. It was slow and technical and required the same kind of sustained attention that restoration required. The willingness to work for hours without visible result, because you understood that the result was being built invisibly, in the places no one was looking yet. In the evenings, she was Lucian's new wife. She attended a dinner with 2 of his senior associates and their partners' men, who treated her with the specific cordial dismissiveness that powerful men reserved for women they considered decorative, and she listened carefully to. Everything they said and remembered everything she heard. She went to a gallery opening with him on Wednesday and held his arm and talked about art with 2 collectors who were actually interested in her opinions, and she noticed that Lucian looked faintly surprised each time someone sought her out specifically. He never understood what he had. The thought came and went without sentimentality. She wasn't interested in mourning what might have been. She was interested in building what came next. On Thursday evening, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. She received a message from a number she didn't recognize. You should know that I had no idea he was getting married. I need you to believe that. She stared at it for a long time. Then she typed back, I believe you. I found 4 years of messages. He wasn't honest with either of us. The response came after several minutes. Can we talk? Vivienne considered this then, not yet. Give me a few more days. She put the phone away and went back to dinner, where Lucian was telling a story about a deal that had gone better than expected. And she watched his face while he talked and thought about all the different versions of this plan she had assembled in her mind over 2 years, all the interpretive charity she had extended to explain away the things that didn't fit. She had been so determined to believe the best version was the real one. She had paid for that determination. On Friday, Gideon Crow stopped by the hotel. He was Lucien's longest-serving lieutenant, a careful man in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the practiced civility of someone who had learned that dangerous men made better allies than enemies. Vivienne had never quite trusted him, which she attributed to something in his eyes, a quality of assessment that he applied to every room he entered, every person he spoke to. He assessed her now, over coffee, while Lucien was on a call in the other room. "How are you settling in?" he asked. His tone was warm. His eyes were doing something different from warm. "Very well," she said. "Boston can be a difficult city if you're not from it." "I've been here for 23 years, she said pleasantly. He smiled. "Of course, I meant the social side. Lucien's world can be particular. I imagine all worlds are particular to people who aren't used to them." He looked at her for a moment. "You're sharper than I expected." She held his gaze without effort. "Most people are, once you actually pay attention to them." A beat. Then he laughed genuinely, she thought, which was more concerning than if it had been false. "He chose well," he said. "I think so," she said. After he left, she sat very still for several minutes. Then she sent Mara a message. Someone inside his organization may be watching the accounts already. Gideon Crow. I think he was testing me. Mara's response came quickly. "How long do you need?" Vivienne looked at the documents on her laptop, at the nearly complete archive, at the folders Mara had helped her organize over the past 5 days. 48 hours, she typed back, maybe less. She closed the laptop and went to pack a bag. Not quickly, not frantically. She packed the way she did everything else, with patience and precision, taking only what she needed, leaving behind what she didn't, making sure that nothing in the room telegraphed that she was going anywhere until she was ready to be gone. The ring sat on her left hand. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the version of herself that had put it on the 51-year-old woman who had been genuinely, completely, without reservation in love with a man who was calculating how long she would be useful. She felt grief for that woman. Specific, acknowledging grief, the kind she had learned to feel without letting it become self-destruction. Then she got back to work. She had 48 hours. She intended to use every one of them. 48 hours was an estimate. She finished in 31. It was Saturday morning, just past 4 a.m., and the hotel suite was completely dark, except for the glow of her laptop screen and the thin line of light coming under the bathroom door where she'd left the vanity light on as cover in case Lucien stirred. He hadn't stirred. He slept the way she had always envied deeply, immediately, with the unconscious ease of a man whose mind did not chase him into the dark. She used to find it restful to sleep beside him. The steadiness of his breathing had felt like something solid to anchor to. Now she understood it differently. It was the sleep of a man with no unresolved guilt, because guilt required a certain acknowledgement of other people's humanity that Lucien Vale applied selectively. Close the last folder. Mara had walked her through the final transfer 2 hours ago over an encrypted call, her voice precise and unhurried, even at 2 in the morning, guiding Vivienne through the last sequence with the patience of a surgeon, explaining a procedure that could not be rushed. The money that was legally hers, not Lucien's, not ambiguous, specifically and documentably hers, under the terms of their joint accounts and the financial structures he had built around the marriage, was now in 3 separate accounts that Lucien had no access to and no knowledge of. Maras had set them up under Vivienne's name alone, using her pre-marriage address and her pre-marriage financial history, severing the connection cleanly. It wasn't everything. Vivienne had not taken everything, even where she arguably could have. She had made that decision early and held to it throughout. Was not interested in ruin. She was interested in exit. There was a version of this where she burned his entire financial architecture to the ground, moved every accessible dollar, filed every piece of documentation with every available regulatory body simultaneously, and watched his world collapse in real time. She had thought about that version. She understood its appeal. She also understood that the version of herself it would require, the one who spent months or years in active combat with a man like Lucien, who kept him in her daily life as an adversary rather than excising him cleanly, was not a version she wanted to become. She had taken what she needed. She had secured the documents. She had made specific choices about where certain information would go, and those choices were already in motion. Time to land after she was gone. Closed the laptop, slid it into her bag. The bag was packed already, had been since Thursday evening, repacked once on Friday, when she remembered the small painting she'd brought from her own apartment. A 4x6-inch oil sketch of a harbor that one of her restoration clients had given her years ago. She wasn't leaving it. She went to the desk and took out the notepad the hotel provided and wrote 4 words. She removed her wedding ring. It went into the small envelope the hotel concierge had included with the welcome package, the one meant for keepsakes. She placed it on top of the note. She picked up her bag. She stood in the doorway between the bedroom and the sitting room and looked at Lucien sleeping for the last time. Not because she wanted the moment. Because she was disciplined enough to know that unwitnessed endings had a way of becoming unresolved ones, and she had already decided that this would be completely resolved, and that resolution started here, in this room, with this look. He was 53 years old, and he looked, in sleep, like a man who had gotten everything he'd ever wanted. Supposed he had. She supposed that was the truest, most clarifying thing she could think about him. She turned away from the door. She walked out. The elevator was empty at 4:17 a.m. The lobby held only a night desk clerk who glanced up from his computer with the automatic courtesy of someone paid to be pleasant at all hours. And Vivienne nodded and crossed the marble floor without slowing and pushed through the revolving door into the September air. Boston at 4 in the morning had a specific quality stripped down. Honest, the city without its performance of itself. Stood on the sidewalk for exactly one breath, and then she walked, not toward the parking structure where her car was, because her car was registered in her name, and Lucien knew her plates, toward the corner where Elise was waiting in an unfamiliar rental. Elise didn't say anything when Vivienne got in. She put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, and they rode in silence for 4 full minutes before Elise said quietly, "Okay?" "Working on it," Vivienne said. "That's honest. I'm trying to be." She looked out at the city moving past. "I left the ring. I know you did. I left a note." Elise glanced at her. What did it say? Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "I know. Good luck." A beat. "That's either the coldest thing I've ever heard," Elise said carefully, "or the most honest." "I was going for honest," Vivienne said. Cold was a side effect. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 5 days she let herself be something other than contained. Not falling apart. She wasn't going to fall apart. She didn't have the capacity for it right now. Maybe later. Weeks from now she would sit somewhere safe and let it move through her completely, but not held together by pure will either. Something in between. Something human and tired and real. "Where are we going?" she asked. "I booked you on the 7 a.m. to Chicago," Elise said. "Under your middle name. I used the card we talked about." Vivienne had a credit card under her middle name Vivienne Claire, the Claire account, that she had maintained since her 30s, not for any particular reason at the time. Just the inheritance of a particular kind of financial caution that her mother had passed on. Always keep something that's only yours. She had mentioned it to Elise once, years ago. Elise had remembered. "Chicago's not far enough," Vivienne said. "Chicago's the connecting flight." Elise paused. "Florence, via Chicago and London. I know you have the contact there, Clara Bellini, the restoration atelier you worked with 4 years ago." Called ahead. Vivienne opened her eyes, turned to look at Elise. "You called Clara. I said you needed a position and couldn't explain fully until you arrived." She said, and I'm quoting, "Tell her the studio is ready and she should stop explaining herself to anyone who wasn't worth explaining herself to." Elise's voice was steady, but her hands on the wheel were slightly tighter than usual. "She sounds like an excellent woman." Vivienne looked at her friend's profile in the dark car and felt something that was too complicated to name gratitude was in it. But underneath the gratitude was 19 years of specific, irreplaceable trust, kind that only existed between people who had been genuinely present for each other's worst moments. Elise had sat with her in the hospital the night her first husband died. She had driven her to court dates and brought her food she didn't eat and called her every single day for 4 months without being asked to. "Thank you," Vivienne said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Stop." Elise shook her head once, the way she always did, when Vivienne thanked her for anything significant. "Just stop." They drove the rest of the way to the airport without talking. Lucien's alarm went off at 6:45. He silenced it with the automatic motion of a man who had used the same alarm at the same time for years, rolled to his left side, and registered the absence before he was fully conscious. Not unusual. She woke early sometimes. He lay still for 30 seconds, assembling the day in his mind the way he always did in the first moments of waking. The calls he needed to make, the meeting with Matteo at noon, the follow-up with Gideon about the account situation that Gideon had flagged on Thursday and that Lucian had not yet fully assessed. Account situation. He was out of bed before the thought finished forming. He went to the desk first, then the bathroom, saw the notepad, the small envelope, and stood very still. He picked up the envelope. The ring fell into his palm. He read the note. He stood in the bathroom of a $4,000 hotel suite in his wedding clothes and looked at 4 words in his wife's handwriting and felt something he could not immediately identify, which was unusual for a man who had spent 30 years being very precise about what he was feeling at any given moment, because precision about emotion was, in his experience, how you stayed ahead of everyone else. What he felt was something adjacent to vertigo. He set the note down. He set the ring down beside it. He went back to the bed and found his phone and called her number. Straight to voicemail. Not ringing straight to voicemail. Her phone was off, or destroyed, or handed to someone else. He called Elise. 4 rings, then Lucian. Her voice was entirely neutral. Where is she? I don't know what you're referring to. Elise. His voice was very controlled, which cost him more than it sounded like it did. Don't. I'm not going to help you find her, Elise said. Her tone didn't shift. I'm going to tell you that she is safe and not in danger, and that is the only information you're going to get from me, regardless of how you ask. He was quiet for a moment. What did she tell you? Enough. Elise, she read the messages, Lucian. A pause, brief and precise. All of them. 4 years of them. Including the one where you explained to someone else that marrying her was a strategy. The word landed like a small, deliberate detonation. She read your words, not a rumor, not a suspicion. Your actual words. Another pause. I hope you understand the difference. He did understand the difference. He understood it completely. He ended the call. He sat on the edge of the bed and held the phone in both hands and looked at the ring on the nightstand and thought about the specific chain of events that had put that ring there. And for the first time since he'd built the architecture of this marriage, he allowed himself to see it without the frame he usually applied, without the vocabulary of strategy and necessity, and the greater complexity of the position he was in, and the things she didn't understand and couldn't understand because she wasn't part of his world. Stripped all of that away, and underneath it was, she loved you. She was completely real, and you calculated it. He sat with that for 40 seconds. Then he called Gideon. Gideon arrived at the hotel at 8:30. He took in the empty suite, the ring on the nightstand, Lucian at the window with his jacket still on from the night before, and he arranged his face into the appropriate expression: concern, loyalty, readiness before he said anything. How much did she take, he asked. I don't know yet, Lucian said. I need you to get Ferris on the accounts. Already called him. Gideon settled into the chair by the window. He'll have numbers by 9. He paused. There was activity Thursday. Low volume, below threshold. I flagged it to you. I remember. You said wait. Lucian turned from the window. I said wait because I didn't think she... He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. Gideon watched him carefully. He had worked for Lucian Vale for 18 years. He had seen him absorb losses, manage crises, absorb betrayals from people who should have known better, and respond with the particular cold efficiency that had made him one of the most durable figures in Boston's landscape of shifting power. He had never seen Lucian Vale absorb something that made him go quiet at the window. She had access because you put her name on everything, Gideon said. Carefully, not cruelly. The careful version. I know what I did. The monitoring system flagged 3 transfers Thursday night and 2 more Friday. He pulled out his phone, looked at something. Total exposure in liquid assets is, he said the number. It was not a small number. Lucian received it without visible reaction. What else, he said. Ferris thinks she also accessed the document storage on the joint investment account. Not just the transactions, the records. He paused to let that land. Copied those records. She copied them, Lucian said. He said it with certainty, not speculation. Then she has documentation connecting the holding structure to... I know what it connects to, Gideon. His voice was quiet, which was a specific register that people who worked for Lucian Vale learned early to distinguish from his ordinary tone. It was not a raised voice. It did not involve visible anger. It was the voice he used when he had already considered every option, and was now moving through them in sequence. What I need to know is where she went. I have people checking transit. She's not stupid. She won't have taken anything traceable. He turned back to the window. She had help. Elise Navarro helped her. Do you want me to? No. Quick and absolute. You don't touch Elise Navarro. You don't go near anyone connected to her. He turned from the window again, and this time he looked directly at Gideon, with an expression that didn't have the usual layers to it. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know how much she knows. I don't know what she's going to do with what she knows. And I don't know how much of this is about money, and how much of it is about other things. Gideon was quiet. The Serena situation, Lucian said. You told me it was managed. I told you a lot of things. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, Boston's morning traffic was beginning to build. What do you want to do? Gideon asked. I want to find her, Lucian said. Not to bring her back. I need to understand what she's holding and what she intends to do with it. He picked up the ring from the nightstand and looked at it, then set it down again. Get me everything you can find on her movements. Serena Voss found out about the note at 10:15 a.m. She wasn't supposed to. She didn't have a direct line to Lucian's household. That was the specific, carefully maintained separation he had kept between the two parts of his life. But she had her own sources. The particular informal network that someone in her position assembled over 4 years of navigating a relationship that existed entirely in the spaces other people weren't looking. She heard from someone who heard from someone that Lucien Vale's wife of 4 days had disappeared from the Fairmont overnight and left a ring behind. Cersina sat with her morning coffee, going cold on her kitchen counter, and thought about what that meant. She thought about the message she had sent on the wedding night. She thought about Vivienne's response 2 days later. I believe you. The forward reply that she had read and reread, parsing its tone for evidence of threat, and finding instead something that frightened her more. Simple acknowledgement. She picked up her phone and sent another message to the number Vivienne had responded from. I heard. I need you to know something. The thing he told me, that the marriage was temporary, he said the same thing to me. About my situation with him. Different words, same logic. I was a strategy too. I just didn't have the documentation to prove it. She sent it. Then she added, I don't know what you're planning. I'm not asking. I just want you to know that if there's anything I can tell you that would help, I will. She set her phone down and looked at her coffee and thought about 4 years of believing she was the real one, the actual center of his emotional life, the relationship he was managing toward rather than away from. She thought about the specific intimacy of being someone's secret, how it had felt, at first like being selected, like being trusted with something precious, like being seen in a way that didn't require performance. She understood now that he had applied the same logic to 2 women simultaneously, the same vocabulary of selection and trust and emotional honesty, running both threads in parallel with the management skill of a man who was good at compartmentalization. She had not been his real relationship. She had been his other strategy. Coffee was completely cold. She poured it down the sink and went to get dressed. At 11:40 a.m., Vivienne was somewhere over Ohio. She had the window seat, which she'd asked for specifically, and she was looking at clouds rather than thinking about what was happening below them in Boston. Because she had made a deliberate decision somewhere around the Chicago connection that she would not spend the 14 hours of travel time running mental simulations of what Lucian was doing. She had made every decision she could make. The documentation was secured. The information that needed to move was already moving. The money was placed. She had done what she came to do. What she had not expected. What she was sitting with in the window seat at 35,000 feet with a coffee she wasn't really drinking was how tired she was. Not the tired of a single sleepless night. The tired of 2 years of small attention she'd paid to a man who wasn't tracking them. 2 years of interpreting generously, extending benefit of the doubt, talking herself out of the moments that didn't fit. That was the exhausting work she hadn't named. Her phone had been replaced before she boarded new number, arranged through Mara, connected to nothing Lucien could trace. The old phone was at the bottom of a trash bin in Logan Airport's departures level. She had received Serena's second message on the new phone, because she had given Serena the new number at the last minute, an impulse decision she was still not entirely sure about. She read the message again. That was a strategy too. She looked out at the clouds. She typed back, I know. He built the whole thing on the same logic and ran it in two directions. You're not responsible for what he did to me. I need you to hear that clearly, because I think he made you feel like you were. She sent it. She thought about the meeting she had arranged before leaving. Not with Mara, not with Elise with a contact. Mara had identified 3 days into their work together. A former federal investigator now working in a private consulting capacity, someone who understood to receive certain kinds of information without creating immediate exposure for the person providing it. Vivian had met with her for 90 minutes on Friday afternoon, while Lucian was at lunch with an associate. She had handed over a specific, curated selection of documentation. Not everything, not enough to be reckless, but enough to establish a pattern that would interest people who were already looking. She had been careful about what she gave. She had been even more careful about the timing. The documentation was set to be formally submitted Monday morning. By that time, she would be in London on her layover, untraceable to anyone who didn't have information she trusted only 3 people with. She closed her eyes. She thought about the note she'd left on the nightstand. I know. Good 4 words. She had written a longer version in her head paragraphs, actually, specific and detailed, and had rejected every iteration of it because more words would have been for her benefit, not his. She had been composing honest statements about Lucian Vale for 5 days and had learned something important. The honest statements were useful for understanding, not for communication. He didn't need her explanations. He needed the space her absence created. Her phone lit up. It was Serena again. He just called me. He knows you're gone. He said he needed to find you to understand what you're going to do. I told him I didn't know where you were, which is true. Pause, then he asked me to come to the hotel. I said no. I think he's realizing this isn't something he can manage. Vivian looked at the message for a long time. Then she replied, good. Let him realize. She put the phone away. Outside the window, the clouds shifted, and for a moment she could see the landscape below, flat and enormous and indifferent. The middle of the country spread out with a generosity that had nothing to do with any of them. She thought about Florence, about Clara Bellini, who she'd worked alongside for 3 weeks 4 years ago, and who had a quality of directness that Vivian had responded to immediately. Not warmth, exactly, though Clara had warmth, but a specific refusal to prettify difficult things that felt like honesty. She needed to be somewhere that felt like honesty. She needed to work with her hands again. Gideon got the transit report back at noon. There were no records of Vivian Ashcombe on any departing flights from Logan Saturday morning. No rental cars. No hotel check-ins in her name within a 50-mile radius of Boston. Her car was still in the Fairmont parking structure. Her primary credit cards hadn't been used since Thursday. She had vanished the way someone vanished, when they'd planned it carefully and had help. He brought this information to Lucian over lunch at the hotel. Lucian hadn't moved from the suite, which was itself notable, and watched his employer receive it with the same quietness that had replaced his normal operating register this morning. She planned this before the wedding, Lucian said. It wasn't a question. The timing on some of the account access suggests yes. Some groundwork was laid before. Lucian was silent. The federal thing, Gideon said carefully. The documentation she accessed. Lucian looked at him. If she's already talked to someone, if she gave any of that to anyone, we may already be looking at. I know. Lucian. He leaned forward slightly. I need you to understand what the exposure looks like if she's... I said I know, Gideon. His voice was still quiet. Still that register. I built those structures. I know exactly what's in them. He looked at the ring on the nightstand, which he hadn't moved. I need to know who she talked to in the 5 days before she left. Elise Navarro. And we think possibly a financial forensics specialist doctor. Mara Reyes? She has an office in the financial district. We're running her. Mara Reyes. He said the name like he was filing it somewhere. Anyone else? Who? Lucian said. There's a retired federal investigator. Name of Patterson. She does private consulting now. He watched Lucian's face. Vivian had a 90-minute meeting with her Friday afternoon. The room went quiet. Lucian stood up and walked to the window, and stood with his back to Gideon for long enough that Gideon counted the seconds, 31 of them, before Lucian turned around. When was the meeting? 2 p.m. Friday. That was he stopped. Did the calculation. That was 4 hours after you flagged the account activity to me. He looked directly at Gideon. You flagged it at 10 a.m. Friday. Yes, I told you to wait. Yes. But if she met Patterson at 2 p.m. Friday, she had already arranged that meeting before I told you to wait. He held Gideon's gaze. Which means she was moving before Thursday. Before your flag. Yes, Gideon said quietly. Which means she saw it coming before either of us did. No one said anything for a moment. Gideon had worked for Lucian Vale for 18 years. He had seen him in situations that would have dismantled most men. He had seen him make decisions under pressure that were technically brilliant and morally indefensible, and he had been present for both parts, and he had stayed, because staying had been the correct calculation at every junction until now. Now he sat across from a man who had been outmaneuvered by his wife of 4 days, and he felt something he had not expected to feel, a very specific and clarifying understanding that the calculation had changed. There's something else, he said. Lucian waited. Matteo called this morning. Gideon chose his words. He's heard things. Nothing specific. He doesn't have specifics, but enough to want a conversation. He's asking about the holding structure, about the relationship between 3 of the entities. He paused. He used the word uncomfortable. Matteo Rusks was not a man who used that word casually. Set up a meeting, Lucian said. He wants it this week. Then this week, he turned back to the window and Gideon. Yes. If you find out where she went, you tell me. You don't send anyone. You don't make any decisions about what to do with that information. You bring it to me directly. He paused. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Gideon understood. He also understood, in that moment, that Lucian was saying it because he was not certain that the instruction would be followed, which meant something about the current state of trust between them that was new and that Gideon would need to think carefully about. Understood, he said. He left the suite at 12:47 p.m. In the elevator going down, he took out his own phone and made a call that had nothing to do with transit records, or Mara Reyes, or finding Vivian Ashcombe. By the time Vivian's plane touched down in London at 7:20 a.m. Sunday, her name had appeared in a preliminary filing at the federal level in connection with the financial documentation submitted by Patterson's office. The filing was preliminary and sealed, which meant it existed, but couldn't be seen by most people, which meant Lucian wouldn't know about it until someone inside the process leaked it to him, which meant she had a window. She sat in Heathrow's Terminal 3, waiting for her Florence connection, and ate a sandwich that tasted like nothing in particular, and thought about the apartment she'd maintained in her own name throughout the marriage small, nothing extravagant. The apartment she'd had before she met Lucian and had kept paying rent on, because her mother's voice in her head had said always keep something that's only yours. She'd given the lease back 2 months after the engagement, because keeping it had started to feel like distrust rather than prudence, and she had wanted to believe that distrust was no longer the framework she needed. She thought about that now. She thought about all the small surrenders she'd made in the name of belief. Her phone lit up with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it anyway because the area code was Boston, and she was still in the habit of tracking what came from there even now. This is Gideon Crow. I know you don't owe me anything, and you have no reason to respond to this. But I need you to know that I flagged the account activity to Lucian on Friday morning, and he told me to wait. I am telling you this because I think you should understand that there are people inside his organization who are not entirely aligned with his interest right now, and that situation is developing. I am also telling you that if you have any interest in what happens to certain people who are not Lucian people, who were used as instruments rather than principals, it may be worth staying informed. I am not asking you to do anything. I am opening a door. Whether you walk through it is entirely your choice. Vivian read it twice. She thought about Gideon in the hotel suite Thursday morning. The assessment in his eyes, the way he had said you're sharper than I expected with what she had read as genuine surprise. She thought about what Mara had told her. The records are more valuable than the money. They tell a story. She thought about the door Gideon was opening and what was behind it, and whether walking through it served the exit she was building or complicated it into something she hadn't intended. She thought about all of this for 4 minutes while her sandwich went uneaten on the plastic tray. Then she typed back, I see the door. I'm not walking through anything yet. But I'm listening. She sent it. She picked up the sandwich. Outside the terminal windows, London was doing what London did on early Sunday mornings in September gray, patient, unimpressed with its own history. And she watched it and ate and thought about the specific irreversible quality of what she had set in motion, how it was already larger than her now, already moving through channels and systems and relationships that had their own momentum and logic, and how she had known, when she started, that this would be the nature of it. She had opened a door too. She had opened several of them. She had made her peace with not controlling what came through. The departure board updated. Her Florence flight was boarding in 40 minutes. She gathered her things with the careful economy of someone who had learned to live with only what she could carry, and she walked toward the gate, and behind her the door she had entered through swung slowly and finally shut. The Florence connection was delayed 40 minutes. Vivian sat in the gate area and watched the departure board and did not think about Boston. She had made a decision somewhere over the Atlantic that she would not spend the available mental space running simulations of what was happening behind her. The filing, the accounts, Lucian at the window of the suite, Gideon in the elevator making a call that had nothing to do with transit records. She had made those decisions. They were in motion. Reviewing them served nothing except the particular anxiety that came from wanting control over things you had already released. So she sat and watched the board and thought about the painting waiting for her in Clara Bellini's atelier. Not a specific painting. She didn't know yet what Clara had on the workbench, but the idea of a painting. The idea of standing in front of something damaged with a specific mandate. Understand the original intention. Find the place where it was compromised. Work backward from the damage to the thing beneath it. That was work she understood. That was work that didn't lie. Her phone lit up. Mara. She answered it on the second ring. Tell me. Something moved this morning that I wasn't expecting. Mara's voice had the quality it got. She was choose carefully. Not slower exactly, but more deliberate. Like she was placing each one where she wanted it before she released it. The filing Patterson submitted. It was sealed, which was the plan, which gives you the window we discussed. But there's a secondary filing that appeared this morning that wasn't ours. Vivian went still. What do you mean it wasn't ours? Someone else filed, independently, and the timing a pause. The timing is not a coincidence. Who? The filing came through a legal entity connected to a man named Riordan. Marcus Riordan. He's a partner at a firm that does work for several of the same holding companies in Lucian's structure, which means he either has his own documentation or he obtained documentation from someone inside the organization. Another pause. The secondary filing is not sealed. It's a civil complaint. It's public record as of this morning. Vivienne heard this. She sat with it for a moment. If it's public, then Lucian can see it. And more importantly, his people can see it. And more importantly than that, anyone who is named in the documentation that was attached to the civil complaint can see it. Mara stopped. Vivienne. Some of what's in Riordan's filing should not be public. Some of what he included is, I don't know how he got it, because it goes deeper than what you gave Patterson. What's he after? I don't know yet. But whoever Riordan is working for, they were already moving before you moved. You didn't start this process. Mara's voice was very level. Someone else started it, and you walked into the middle of it without knowing it was already in motion. The departure board updated. Still delayed. Vivienne looked at it without seeing it. Is my name in the civil complaint? No, not yet. But if Riordan's client knows you gave documentation to Patterson, and if they decide that connecting you publicly serves their purpose, they could put my name in a subsequent filing. Yes. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant, not abstractly, not theoretically, but concretely, her name attached to a public civil complaint connected to Lucian Vale's financial structure, which meant journalists, which meant her daughter seeing it, which meant Clara Bellini reading about it, before Vivienne had a chance to explain anything herself. How long do I have before this becomes visible to journalists? It's already indexable. It went public at 6 this morning London time. The financial press watches these filings. A pause. Hours. Vivienne closed her eyes. Not from distress, from the specific necessary discipline of a woman who could not afford distress right now. She was counting. She was mapping. She was doing the thing she always did in the first seconds of understanding the true scope of the damage, measuring it without flinching so that she could decide what to do about it. I need to know who Riordan's client is, she said. I'm working on it. Work faster. She paused. And Maris Patterson aware of the secondary filing? Called her before I called you. She's aware. She's also another careful pause. She's concerned that the secondary filing may complicate the sealed one, that it may force a faster timeline than we planned. Faster timeline meant exposure before Vivienne was positioned for it. Exposure before Florence. Exposure while she was still in transit, untethered, with no stable ground under her. "What do you need from me right now?" Vivienne asked. "Nothing yet. I need an hour to trace Reardon's filing backward." A brief pause. "Where are you?" "Still in London. My connection is delayed." "Get on the plane when it boards," Mara said. "Get to Florence. Whatever is happening, you are better positioned from somewhere settled than from an airport." "I know." And Vivienne, a beat. "I'm sorry, I didn't see this coming." "Neither did I," Vivienne said. "Which is the problem?" She ended the call. She sat in the gate area of Terminal 3 and looked at the gray London morning through the windows and thought about the specific, vertiginous sensation of realizing that the board you thought you were playing on was larger than the one you'd mapped. In Boston, Lucian found out about the civil complaint at 7:58 a.m. Sunday. Not from Gideon. From his attorney, Vincent Hale, who called him in the kind of tone that attorneys used when they needed to communicate urgency without creating panic, which was a tone Lucian recognized and immediately classified correctly. Something had already happened. It was bad, and Vincent was managing his own alarm before transmitting the content. "A civil complaint was filed this morning," Vincent said. "Public record. It names 3 of your entities by name. It includes documentation. I'm looking at it now, that establishes financial relationships between those entities and 2 individuals whose names you will recognize." Lucian was already at his desk, laptop open. "Send me the filing." "I'm looking at Lucian. This is not from your wife." He stopped typing. "What?" "This predates her. The documentation in this filing is older than anything she would have accessed last week. Whoever filed this has been building a case for considerably longer than 5 days." A pause. "The firm of record is Riordan and Associates, Marcus Riordan." Lucian knew that name. The knowing happened in his body before it arrived in his mind, a sudden, specific tightening across his chest that was not quite pain, but lived in the same neighborhood. Marcus Riordan had done legal work for several of the holding companies in Lucian's structure, not directly, but at 2 removes. He was connected to people who were connected to Lucian's people, which meant the documentation in that filing had come from inside. "Who is he working for?" Lucian said. That's what I'm trying to determine." "Vincent, I need more time." "How much time do we have before the financial press picks this up?" Pause. "It may already be indexed." Lucian looked at the window. The Boston morning was doing its usual Sunday thing, quiet, self-contained, entirely indifferent. He thought about Matteo Rusk calling yesterday and using the word uncomfortable. He thought about Gideon's call Friday morning. He thought about Vivienne in the suite for 5 days, sitting across from him at dinner, holding his arm at the gallery, asking no suspicious questions. He thought about the specific architecture of everything he had built and the number of people who had access to different parts of it. "Get me a list of everyone with documentation access to those 3 entities in the last 18 months, he said. Not the public-facing people. Everyone. Including the people who were there for meetings and shouldn't have retained anything but might have. That list is going to be longer than you want it to be. Then it's a long list. Get it to me." He ended the call and sat back and thought about 2 separate things moving simultaneously: Vivienne, somewhere over Europe, with Patterson's sealed filing, and Riordan, somewhere in Boston, with something older and deeper, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had been in complicated situations before, that he was now looking at 2 separate threats, with different origins, and different timelines, and different kinds of damage potential. One of them he had created by underestimating his wife. The other one he had created by trusting someone he shouldn't have. Question was, which was going to hit first? Plane boarded at 9:45 a.m. Vivienne found her seat window again. Automatic at this point, the window was where she processed things, and watched the other passengers settle and thought about Gideon's message. There are people inside his organization who are not entirely aligned with his interests right now. She had read that and thought, opening a door. She read it now, replaying it in her mind, and thought, which door exactly? And what's actually behind it? Because the thing about a man like Gideon Crow, a man who had spent 18 years making correct calculations about where to stand and when, was that he did not open doors for other people's benefit. He opened doors because walking through them served something he was already building. And if Gideon was already building something, then the civil complaint from Riordan and Associates was not a coincidence, and the timing of Gideon's message to her at 7:30 a.m. London time was not a coincidence. And the specific offer he had made information, staying informed, "I am not asking you to do anything," was not neutral. He was positioning her. She didn't know yet as what. Plane pushed back from the gate. She watched the tarmac slide past and thought about the 18 months of documentation in Riordan's filing older than anything she had touched, deeper than the access Lucian had given her. That documentation came from somewhere inside, someone with longer history and closer proximity than a wife of 4 days. Someone who had been waiting for the right moment. The plane lifted. She looked at the clouds coming up to meet her and thought, Gideon has been building this for longer than I have. And he used my exit as cover. Lucian had the list by noon. 43 names. People with direct or indirect documentation access to the 3 entities named in Riordan's filing across the past 18 months. He went through them methodically, eliminating the ones with nothing to gain and insufficient access, narrowing the field with the kind of systematic attention that he applied to every complex problem and that served him well for 30 years. He got to 14 names, then to 6. Then he stopped at 1 and sat with it. Called Gideon. No answer. He called the private number Gideon used for internal organizational matters, a number that had not gone unanswered in 18 years. No answer. He sat back and looked at the ceiling and felt the specific nauseating sensation of a man who has just understood something that had been true for a long time and that he should have seen earlier. He called Matteo Rusk. Matteo answered on the first ring, which was itself information. "I need to see you," Lucian said now. "Not this week. Now." A brief pause. "Come to the house." Matteo's voice was careful. Not unfriendly, not warm either. The voice of a man who had his own calculations running. "I'll be here." Lucian arrived at Matteo Rusk's house in Brookline 40 minutes later. Matteo opened the door himself, no assistant, no staff visible, which was deliberate, and led him to the study at the back of the house where they'd had every significant conversation of the past 20 years. The study had not changed in that time. Matteo was 71 and had the quality of a man who had decided long ago what mattered and arranged his environment accordingly. He poured 2 glasses of water and sat down. "You know about the filing," Lucian said. "I've known about a filing for considerably longer than this morning," Matteo said carefully. Lucian looked at him. "Not that specific filing," Matteo said, "but the existence of a process, a building of documentation, preparation." He held Lucian's gaze without discomfort. "I knew something was coming. I didn't know from which direction." "How long?" 4 months. 4 months. Lucian received this information. He placed it in the timeline he was assembling 4 months ago, which was when the engagement became public, which was when the federal scrutiny had begun to sharpen, which was when he had made the decision to accelerate the marriage rather than slow it down. "Who told you?" he said. Matteo was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter at this point?" "It matters to me." "Then I'll tell you, but I want you to hear me first." Matteo leaned forward slightly, the way he did when he was moving from civil to direct. "Lucian, what you built, the structure, the holding companies, the relationships between the entities, I have looked the other way on some of what that structure required because I believed you were managing it and because I trusted your judgment. I told myself the details were yours to own." He paused. "I should not have looked the other way." "Matteo, let me finish." His voice was not raised. It was something more authoritative than raised, completely certain of its own weight. "The filing this morning names 3 entities. The documentation in that filing shows financial relationships that touch my name. Not directly, but at one remove, through a transaction I authorized in good faith 2 years ago that your people structured in a way I was not fully informed about." His eyes were steady. "I have a lawyer looking at my exposure right now, and I have a great deal of anger that is going in a specific direction." The room was very quiet. "Gideon," Lucian said. Matteo looked at him. "Gideon structured that transaction," Lucian said. Wasn't he stopped? Because he was about to say, "I wasn't aware of how he structured it," and that was true, and it was also the most damning possible truth, that in his own organization, his most trusted lieutenant had been moving pieces in ways that Lucian hadn't tracked, And the reason Lucian hadn't tracked it was that he had trusted Gideon the way he had trusted no one else. And that trust had been exactly the vulnerability that someone with 18 years of access would know how to use. Gideon is not answering his phone, Lucian said. Matteo looked at him with an expression that was not quite pity, something adjacent to it, something that acknowledged a very specific and human kind of disaster. No, he said, I don't imagine he is. Gideon was in a hotel room in Providence. He had checked in the previous evening under a name that had required preparation, the kind of preparation that took longer than overnight, which meant he had been planning his exit for considerably longer than Lucian had been planning his response. He sat at the small desk with his laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow and read the coverage of the Riordan, filing with the focused attention of a man, checking the results of an experiment he'd been running for some time. It was going where he had calculated it would go. He had been careful. He had been very, very careful. More careful than Lucian had ever been, which was itself a kind of justice, because Lucian had never fully understood that the caution he applied to external threats he had completely failed to apply to the man who sat 12 feet from him every day. Gideon had not done this for the money. The money was a component. He was not romantic about that. But the money was not the engine. The engine was 18 years of being the man who made Lucian Vale's empire functional, 18 years of solving the problems Lucian created and absorbing the consequences of Lucian's decisions, and being paid very well for that service without ever once being treated as a partner rather than an instrument. 18 years of watching Lucian extend trust to the idea of people while managing the reality of them the way you managed resources, efficiently and without sentiment. He had learned that from Lucian. He had applied it to Lucian. He thought about Vivienne's response to his message. I see the door. I'm not walking through anything yet, but I'm listening, and he thought it was the most honest thing anyone in Lucian Vale's orbit had said in years. She wasn't going to trust him blindly. She was going to watch and assess, which meant she was exactly what he had calculated her to be, someone with enough clarity to be useful and enough caution to be manageable. He had not told her what he'd done. He had not told her about the 18 months of documentation he'd been quietly building, or the relationship with Riordan, or the specific transaction involving Matteo that he had structured in a way that would eventually create pressure on Lucian from a direction he wouldn't immediately identify as Gideon. He had not told her because she didn't need to know. She needed to believe she was a principal. She was a useful instrument, and instruments function better when they believed they were choosing. He drank his coffee. Outside Providence was doing nothing interesting. Thought about his next move. Clara Bellini was 63 years old and had run her restoration atelier on the Via dei Servi for 22 years. She was a small woman with ink-stained hands and the particular quality of stillness that came from decades of close work, the ability to be completely present in a space without filling it, to exist beside other people's attention without competing with it. She was waiting at the atelier door when Vivienne's taxi pulled up at 4:30 p.m. She does not say anything immediately. She looked at Vivienne for a moment, the way she looked at damaged work, fully, without softening the look, without the diplomatic smile that most people deployed when they didn't know what they were looking at. Then she said, "You look like you've been awake for too long." 31 hours, Vivienne said. "Come in." The atelier smelled the way Vivienne remembered linseed oil and spirits, and the dry, specific smell of old canvas. It was not a large space, but it had height, the ceiling reaching 14 feet, and 3 north-facing skylights that produced the flat, consistent light that restoration work required. 2 paintings were on the work tables. A third was on an easel near the window, covered. Clara led her past all of them to the back room, which served as a small office and sitting area, and she put a kettle on and sat across from Vivienne without preamble. "Tell me the minimum I need to know," she said. Vivienne told her. She was efficient about it. The marriage, the discovery, the 5 days, the exit. She mentioned Lucian's name once and did not elaborate on who he was. She mentioned the filing situation as cleanly as she could. Clara listened without interrupting. When Vivienne finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you in physical danger?" she said. "I don't believe so." "He's not a man who would—" She stopped, because she had been about to say something she was no longer certain was true. "He hasn't been that kind of man in his dealings with me. Whether the situation changes what he's capable of, I don't know." Then we assume the better case and prepare for the worse one, Clara said. You have a room upstairs. You have a position here as long as you need it. What you tell the people in this building about why you're here is your business. She poured the tea. And what happened in Boston stays in Boston until you decide differently. Vivian looked at her. You're not going to ask more. You told me what I needed. The rest is yours. Clara set a mug in front of her. Drink, then sleep. Whatever is waiting in Boston will still be waiting when you're functional. Vivian drank. She was sitting in a chair in a restoration atelier in Florence, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, 22 hours of travel in her body, and something enormous and unresolved moving through channels she could no longer fully track. Thought, not for the first time, but with unusual clarity, that she had made every decision she could make with the information she had, and that some of what was now in motion was beyond her, and had perhaps always been beyond her. She thought about Gideon's door, about what was behind it. Her phone buzzed Mara. She answered it. I have Riordan's client, Mara said. She sounded tired in a way that was new. It took longer than an hour because the connection is indirect. And I wasn't looking in the right direction initially. Who is it? It's Gideon Crow, Mara said. Riordan is working for Gideon. The documentation in the civil filing, the 18 months of material, that's deeper than anything you accessed. Gideon built that. He's been building it for a year and a half. He used your exit as a simultaneous distraction. A pause. Vivienne. He contacted you from Providence. He was already gone when he sent you that message. The atelier was very quiet. Clara watched Vivienne's face with the attention of someone who had learned to read damage. He used me, Vivienne said. Her voice was completely level. Not because she was managing it. She had moved past management into a different register, the one that existed on the other side of the full understanding of a thing. Your exit created cover, Mara said carefully. The financial activity, the account movement, the sealed federal filing. It gave Lucian multiple simultaneous problems to track, and it bought Gideon the window to move the civil complaint publicly before anyone inside the organization understood what was happening. He opened a door, Vivienne said. He told me he was opening a door, and I thought he was offering me something, and he was using me to distract the man he was betraying. Yes, she sat with that. Does Lucian know it's Gideon? I don't know yet. But if he's as smart as you've described. He knows, Vivienne said. He's figured it out by now. Which means he's sitting with the specific experience of being betrayed by the person he trusted most in his entire organization. She paused. Which means he's also sitting with the understanding that everything he built, every structure, every holding company, every relationship, was visible to someone who was using it. She paused again. He understands now what I felt, she said. Reading those messages, the specific feeling of the ground moving. The silence on the phone was careful. What do you want to do? Mara asked. Viviette looked at the mug in her hands. She looked at Clara, who was watching her with the kind of uncomplicated, steady attention that was harder to find than almost anything else in the world. She thought about Gideon in his hotel room somewhere, running his calculation. She thought about Lucian in Boston, trying to reach a man who wasn't answering his phone. She thought about the sealed filing and the public one, and the federal process now moving at its own pace through its own channels, with or without her ongoing participation. She thought about how she had walked out of that suite, with 4 words on a notepad and a ring in an envelope, and believed, with some naivety she could see clearly now, that she was the one initiating. She had been a move in someone else's game. She had also made real moves of her own. Both things were true. I need to talk to Patterson, she said. Tonight. Whatever hour it is in Boston. She set the mug down. And I need you to find out exactly what Gideon's endgame is. Not what he told me, not the door he described, but what he actually wants out of this when the civil complaint runs its course and the sealed filing surfaces and Lucian's organization fractures. She paused. Because he's not doing this for justice. He's doing this for position. And I need to understand what position he's trying to take before he gets there. I'll find out, Mara said. One more thing. Vivian looked at the covered painting on the easel across the room. Whatever Gideon used me for, whatever I gave him by moving when I moved, I need to know whether I can separate my actions from his. Legally, cleanly, whether Patterson's sealed filing can stand on its own without being contaminated by the fact that Gideon was running a parallel process. I'll ask her tonight. Thank you, she paused. I mean it. I know you do. A beat. Get some sleep. She ended the call. Clara was still watching her with that calm, undemanding attention. Someone used your exit as cover for their own, Clara said. It wasn't a question. Yes, and now you're not sure how much of what you did was yours and how much of it served someone else. Vivienne looked at her. Yes, Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, in restoration, there is a principle we return to when we find that someone else has worked on a piece before us. Often badly, often in ways that created new damage while trying to address old damage. She stood and carried her own mug to the small sink. You don't throw the work away because someone else touched it first. You identify what was original, what was added, and what was corrupted. And you work from the original outward. She rinsed the mug. What you did leaving, taking what was yours, giving documentation to investigators, that was original. That it coincided with someone else's plan doesn't make it less yours. Vivienne sat with that. The room is upstairs, Clara said. Second door on the left. Vivienne stood. She gathered her bag. She was so tired that the exhaustion had moved past the physical into something almost metaphysical. A tiredness of having understood too many things in too short a time, of having had the ground move and moved with it, and now needing, desperately, to be somewhere still. She went upstairs. The room was small and spare, and had one window looking out over the rooftops toward the dome of the Duomo, catching the last of the afternoon light. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it and thought about what Clara had said, what was original, what was added, what was corrupted, and she held that principle in her mind the way she would hold a tool she intended to use. She had thought she was the one who'd set things in motion. She had thought she understood the shape of what she'd started. She had been wrong about the shape, but she had not been wrong about the starting. And tomorrow, after sleep, after Patterson, after Mara's report on Gideon's endgame, she was going to have to decide what to do with the understanding that the situation she was navigating was considerably larger and more dangerous than the one she had planned for, and that navigating it successfully was going to require her to become something she had not needed to be yet, not careful, not patient, not the woman who observed before she acted. Something sharper, something that understood not just her own moves, but everyone else's simultaneously, in real time, without the luxury of a 5-day window and a hotel suite and a husband who thought she was sleeping. She lay back on the bed. She did not sleep immediately. She looked at the ceiling and thought about Gideon, and about the door he had opened, and about the fact that she had told him she was listening. She was still listening, but the nature of what she was listening for had completely changed. She called Patterson at 11 p.m. Florence time, which was 5 p.m. in Boston, which meant Patterson had been working for 12 hours straight and sounded like it. I was going to call you, Patterson said. Her voice had the texture of someone running on coffee and compressed urgency. The Riordan filing complicated things. Not fatally, but I need you to understand what we're dealing with now. Mara told me Gideon built the civil complaint. He did. 18 months of documentation, some of which overlaps with what you gave me, and some of which goes considerably deeper. A pause, the kind that contained information being organized before delivery. The overlap is the problem. When two separate filings touch the same evidence base, investigators look at the sourcing. They want to know who had access to what and when, and whether the two processes coordinated. We didn't coordinate. I know that. You know that. Question is whether it looks like coordination. And right now, another pause. Right now it looks like coordination. Because the timing is identical, and the evidence categories are adjacent, and Gideon has been in contact with you. Vivienne felt the specific cold of that land in her chest. He contacted me after I was already gone. I didn't respond substantively. I know. But he contacted you, and you responded, and that exchange exists in a record that investigators will eventually see. Patterson's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone delivering a diagnosis accurate, direct, without the softening that made diagnoses less useful. Vivienne, I need to ask you something directly. Ask. Did you know about Gideon's process when you started yours? No. Did you have any indication that someone inside Vale's organization was building a separate case? No. I had an indication that Gideon was watching the accounts. I interpreted it as loyalty to Lucian, not as independent action. And after he contacted you in London, I told him I was listening. I didn't give him anything, and I didn't agree to anything. I was trying to understand what he was doing. Silence on the line for a moment. That's going to have to be documented, Patterson said. Your account of the sequence, every contact, every response, the timing of everything. I need it in writing before the end of tomorrow. Because if investigators call you in for a conversation and you don't have a clean documented account of your own timeline, you are in a vulnerable position. Define vulnerable. Potentially a witness in a federal investigation rather than a separate civil complainant. Potentially someone whose cooperation becomes the thing investigators want rather than the documentation you already gave me. A breath. The documentation stands. What you gave me is real, and it's useful, and it's going to do what you intended it to do to Lucian's financial structure. But the question of your positioning, whether you're protected or exposed, that depends on how clearly we can establish that your process was entirely independent of Gideon's. Vivian sat on the edge of the bed in the small room above Clara's atelier and looked at the dark window and thought about what independent meant and whether it was still true. She had been independent when she started. She had been independent for 5 days in that hotel suite. She had been independent when she walked out, when she got on the plane, when she handed the documentation to Patterson. Then Gideon had sent a message, and she had replied. 2 words, I'm listening. 2 words that now sat in a record somewhere, connecting her timeline to his, creating the appearance of coordination between 2 people who had, in fact, been running entirely separate processes toward what happened to be an overlapping target. Can we establish independence, she said. We can establish it, Patterson said. It requires work and it requires your complete transparency with me about everything, every contact, every conversation, every decision point in the past 10 days. Nothing held back, nothing is held back. Then we have a case to make. Patterson paused. There's one more thing. Vivian waited. Lucian Vale's attorney contacted the federal office this afternoon. Voluntarily. He offered cooperation. She heard that. He's going to cooperate, she said. His attorney opened the conversation. We don't know the scope yet, but if Lucian cooperates, if he gives investigators what they want about the organizational structure, then the sealed filing becomes less necessary as an evidentiary tool and more useful as leverage. Another pause. It also means that whatever Lucian tells investigators about you, about your access, your role in the marriage, what you knew, and when becomes part of the record. What would he tell them? That's what I don't know yet. And that's what I need you to prepare for. After the call, Vivienne sat in the dark for a long time. She had walked out of a hotel suite 10 days ago with 4 words on a notepad and a clarity of purpose that had felt at the time like the cleanest thing she'd done in years. She had been precise and careful and deliberate, and she had built something she believed would hold. Now she was sitting in Florence at midnight, trying to assess whether the structure she'd built was going to protect her, or become the thing that exposed her, and the answer depended on a man she had left, and a man she had never trusted, and a federal process that moved at its own pace with its own logic and cared nothing about her intentions. She lay back. She stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep for a long time. Lucian met with federal investigators Monday morning. Not because he had no choice. He understood, even now, even in this, that there were always choices. He met with them because Vincent Hale had spent Sunday night laying out the precise topology of his current exposure, the specific intersections between the civil complaint and the sealed filing and the 18 months of documentation that Gideon had compiled. And at the end of that 2-hour conversation, Lucian had sat back and said, with the flatness of a man who had finished calculating, what does cooperation actually look like? Vincent had told him. It looked like a conference room in a federal building on Monday morning, with 2 investigators who were professional and courteous, and whose courtesy was a tool rather than a sentiment. It looked like a documented conversation about the organizational structure of 3 holding companies, the financial relationships between them, and the names of people who had been principals in transactions that were now of federal interest. It looked like Lucian Vale, 53 years old, sitting across a table from the government and choosing the version of truth that served his survival without destroying everything that remained salvageable. He did not mention Vivienne as a knowing participant. He mentioned her as someone who had been given access for the purpose of making a marriage appear legitimate during a period of scrutiny, which was true and which also happened to be, in the specific vocabulary that federal investigators used, an admission that made him look worse rather than better. He said it anyway. because the alternative was constructing a narrative about her that he did not believe, and that contradicted documentation they almost certainly already had. He had stopped lying to himself about her the moment he found the ring. He was not going to start again in a federal building. The investigators asked about Gideon. He told them what he knew. He told them specifically, without embellishment, the full scope of what Gideon had had access to, what he had built, and what Lucian had put together in the past 48 hours about the timeline of Gideon's preparation. He told them about the transaction involving Matteo that Gideon had structured in a way Lucian hadn't fully tracked. He told them about the call Friday morning, the flag about account activity, and his instruction to wait, and his subsequent understanding that the flag was not loyalty, it was confirmation of timing. He sat in that room for 4 hours. When he came out, Vincent was waiting in the corridor. "How bad?" Lucian said. "You were honest," Vincent said. "The best thing you could have done today. The rest we manage." "That's not what I asked." Vincent looked at him steadily. "It's bad, Lucian, but it's survivable. The difference between surviving this and not surviving it is going to come down to cooperation and time, and whether Gideon does something stupid before investigators find him." He paused. "He's still in Providence. They know where he is. He'll run. Probably. But running changes his position considerably more than it changes yours right now." Vincent picked up his briefcase. "Go home. Don't talk to anyone. Don't contact anyone connected to the organization. Let me work." Lucian went home. His actual house, the back bay, brownstone he'd owned for 11 years, felt different than it had the last time he'd been in it, before the wedding. He stood in the front hall and looked at the rooms he could see from where he was standing and tried to identify what had changed, and realized after a moment that nothing had changed. The house was the same. He was different, or his understanding of himself was different, which might be the same thing. He went to the study. He sat down. He did not call anyone. He thought about Gideon sitting in a hotel room in Providence, running a calculation about when to run and where to go, and how much runway he had before the calculation had to execute. He thought about the specific intimacy of betrayal, how it required proximity, how it could only come from someone you had trusted with the real structure of things, how 18 years of that kind of access had given Gideon everything he needed. He thought about what Matteo had said: "You built it on secrecies," and the belief that people were resources. He thought about his wife. He picked up the phone. He looked at Vivian's old number, the one he'd been calling for 3 days into voicemail, and he set the phone back down. There was nothing to say right now that would serve anything except his own need to say something, and that was not a reason to make a call. He sat in his study and waited for what was coming. Gideon ran on Tuesday. Not far, and not fast enough. These things never were, despite how clean they looked in the planning stages. He made it to a regional airport in Connecticut and got on a flight to Miami under the third identity he'd prepared, which told investigators who were already watching him that he had at least 2 identities they hadn't found yet. The Miami flight landed at 2:15 p.m. He was in custody by 2:50. Vivian found out from Mara at 4 p.m. Florence time. She was in the atelier when the message came, actually working, hands on a 17th century panel painting that Clara had assigned her, a damaged Madonna with a crack running from the upper left corner through the blue of the robe to the figure's right hand. She was doing the preliminary assessment, recording what she saw before she touched anything, because that was always the first step. Understand the damage in its entirety before you make a single decision about how to address it. She read Mara's message, set the phone down, looked at the painting. Crack had been there a long time. Could tell, by the way, the paint had settled into it. Not a fresh break, nothing violent or sudden, but the long, slow product of structural stress that had been building for years before it finally expressed itself visibly. She had seen this before. She had seen it many times. The crack was never the problem. The crack was just the moment the problem became visible. She picked up the phone and called Mara. "Walk me through it," she said. He made it to Miami. They had people at the airport. He didn't know they'd been on him since Providence. Mara's voice was brisk, not unkind. "He's in federal custody. He's going to talk, Vivian, because the alternative for him is considerably worse than talking. He's going to tell them everything about the civil complaint, about the 18 months of documentation, about his plan, and about me. He's going to tell them what he told you, that he saw your exit and used it as cover. That he contacted you in London. That you responded. A pause. His account of that contact is going to be self-serving. He's going to describe you as someone who was aware of what he was doing. I wasn't. I know you weren't. Patterson knows you weren't. The documentation we have about your timeline, the independent timeline, the sequence you sent her last night solves it. Another pause. But Gideon has a reason to complicate your picture. Because if investigators believe you were coordinated with him, then your sealed filing becomes part of his case rather than a separate instrument, and that serves him. Vivienne understood the logic. It was clean and cold, and exactly the kind of move she would expect from a man who had spent 18 years making calculations. What does Patterson need? She said. She needs you to make yourself available for a conversation with investigators. Voluntarily, before they ask. Mara's voice was careful. They have to come to you. It looks defensive. If you go to them first, it establishes a posture. I'm in Florence. Video this week. She can arrange it. Vivienne looked at the crack in the Madonna's robe. Set it up. The call with investigators happened Wednesday at 10 a.m. Florence time. Patterson was present. A federal investigator named Solis, who had the specific quality of someone who had heard every version of every story and was primarily interested in the version that matched the documents. A second investigator named Chen, who spoke less and watched more, and whose watching had a quality that Vivienne recognized as the kind of attention that noticed the things words didn't cover. Vivienne had slept. She had eaten. She had spent Tuesday working on the panel painting for 6 hours, and had not thought about Boston for stretches of 20 and 30 minutes at a time, which was progress. She sat in front of the laptop in Clara's small office, with her hands flat on the table where they could be seen, and she answered every question directly. How had she obtained access to the accounts? Lucian had added her name, for the purpose of presenting a legitimate marriage during federal scrutiny. When had she become aware the access was broader than typical joint financial arrangements? Approximately 10 days before the wedding, when she reviewed the documentation for the first time with a financial professional. Who was the professional? Mara Reyes. Had she retained Mara Reyes before or after discovering the messages on Lucian's tablet? She had contacted Elise Navarro after discovering the messages. Elise had connected her with Mara. The first call with Mara occurred the same night. Solis asked about Gideon. Vivienne told the truth. Every contact, every word, the exact text of what he'd sent and what she'd replied. She told it in sequence without embellishment and without the defensive framing that people used when they were managing the story rather than reporting it. Chen watched her throughout. Ms. Ashcombe, Solsa said. When Crow contacted you and described people inside Vale's organization who were not aligned with Vale's interests, did you interpret that as an offer of alliance? I interpreted it as someone trying to establish usefulness, Vivienne said. I didn't know at that point what he had built or what he was planning. I responded because I thought information about the internal state of Lucian's organization might be relevant to my own position. Did you share any information with Crow in return? No. Did you agree to any course of action? No. The response you sent, I see the door. I'm not walking through anything yet. But I'm listening. In your understanding, what did that communicate? Vivienne looked directly at the camera. That I was cautious. That I wasn't committing. That I would assess before deciding. She paused. I have spent 30 years assessing damaged things before deciding what to do about them. That is not a strategic posture. It's a trained reflex. A beat. Solis looked at something off-screen. Chen's expression did not change. Thank you for your time, Solis said. After the call, Patterson stayed on the line. That was well done, she said. I told the truth. That's what made it well done. A pause. I think you're going to be all right on the positioning question. Solis is good at reading the difference between someone managing a story and someone reporting one. Another pause. There's something else. Lucian Vale cooperated Monday. I know. He did not characterize you as a knowing participant in anything. He described your access as his decision, made for his own reasons, without your full understanding of the structure. Patterson's voice was careful. That was not the characterization that served him best. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. He told the truth, she said. Yes. She sat with that. All right, she said. Thank you, Patterson. She closed the laptop. Clara appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea. She had a quality of appearing at the right moment without appearing to have timed it, and sat once on the desk and leaned against the doorframe. "How did it go?" she said. "I think all right." Vivian picked up the mug, told them the truth about me. Clara waited. Lucian. When he cooperated, he didn't. He could have constructed something that helped him by making me look like I knew more than I did. He didn't. Does that surprise you? Vivian thought about it honestly. Parts of him were real, she said. That's what made the other parts so damaging. She held the mug in both hands. I knew him well enough to know what he was capable of when he decided something mattered. I didn't know for a long time that I wasn't one of those things. She paused. I think I might be now, which is she stopped. It's too late to be useful. But it's not nothing. Clara looked at her steadily. Come back to the painting, she said. The panel needs another hour before we can make any decisions about the crack. Vivian stood. She was grateful. In that moment, for a woman who understood that work was not an escape from difficult things, but a way of staying in the same room with them, without letting them become the only thing in the room. She followed Clara back to the atelier. Thursday in Boston was cold for September. Lucian walked into the Federal Building at 8 a.m. for a second session that Vincent had arranged as a continuation of Monday's cooperation, more detail on the holding structure, more specificity on the transaction histories. He wore the same kind of suit he'd always worn and carried the same kind of briefcase and walked into the building with the same quality of physical self-possession he'd had for 30 years, because some things were structural rather than performed. But Matteo was not returning his calls. 3 of his captains had requested meetings through attorneys rather than directly, which was the organizational equivalent of building a wall between 2 people who used to share a room. 2 associates, whose names appeared in the civil complaint, had retained their own counsel and were, according to Vincent, almost certainly cooperating independently. His empire was not destroyed. It was fragmenting. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between a clean break and a long, irregular collapse, the kind that took years and cost more energy than the original building had required. He sat in the conference room and answered questions and thought, between questions, about the specific quality of Vivienne's absence. Not her. He was careful about that distinction. Careful not to let what he was feeling collapse into something sentimental. But her absence had a texture. She had been, whatever else was true, the most attentive person he had been in close proximity to in years. And that quality of attention, the kind that noticed things and held them without immediately reacting, had created something in the room with them that he had not recognized as valuable while it was present. He recognized it now. After the session, walking out onto the street, Vincent said, the positioning is holding. They're focused on Gideon and the organizational structure. Your cooperation is working the way we hoped. Good. There's going to be financial exposure. Significant. But manageable if we're methodical. Vincent looked at him. You'll survive this. I know, Lucian said. He said it without satisfaction, just as information, accurate and not particularly comforting. Vincent. He stopped on the sidewalk. Is there a legal reason I can't contact her? Vincent looked at him carefully. Her attorney would probably prefer you didn't. But no legal prohibition, no, not currently. A pause. Lucian. Whatever you're thinking. I'm not thinking anything yet, he said. I just wanted to know the answer. He walked away from the Federal Building into the cold Thursday morning, and the city was loud and indifferent around him. And he thought about Florence, because he knew that was where she was. Elise hadn't told him. But Elise had said the name Clara Bellini once, 2 years ago, when Vivienne was describing someone she'd worked with and admired, and Lucian had filed it away, with the automatic retention of a man who tracked details, and he had forgotten he'd filed it until now. He knew the city. He knew the work she'd go back to. He thought about her, standing in front of something damaged with that specific quality of assessment she had. The unhurried, unfrightened willingness to look at the full extent of the damage before deciding anything. He thought about what that quality would cost her right now. Being the one who had to look at the full extent, he wanted to tell her something. He was not yet certain what. He walked 3 blocks in the wrong direction before he noticed, then corrected himself and kept moving. Thursday evening in Florence, Vivienne was working late. Clara had gone home at 7. The atelier was empty except for Vivienne and the panel painting and the specific focused quiet of a room where concentrated attention had lived for 22 years and left something of itself in the walls. The north skylights were dark now, no natural light at this hour, and she was working under the careful artificial light she and Clara had set up together, color-corrected lamps that let you see a painting, the way it was meant to be seen rather than the way convenience preferred. She had been looking at the crack for 2 days. She understood it now. The structural cause was a seam in the underlying panel, 2 pieces of wood joined centuries ago, the joint eventually giving under the accumulated pressure of temperature change and humidity and time. The paint layer had held longer than the structure beneath it, which was sometimes how it went. The surface maintained integrity after the foundation had already begun to fail, and the crack only expressed itself when the differential became too great to absorb. She had begun to stabilize it, not repair its stabilization first, always. You secured the existing damage before you attempted to address it, because attempting to address unstabilized damage created new damage. Her phone buzzed, unknown number, Boston area code. She looked at it. She did not answer immediately. She set down her tool and wiped her hands on the cloth. She kept draped over her shoulder and looked at the number for a long moment. Then she answered. Vivienne. His voice had a quality she didn't immediately recognize, stripped of something, the particular confidence that had always been its foundation sound, the resonance of a man who entered every room, assuming he had the most information in it. She said nothing. I'm not calling to. He stopped. I don't know exactly why I'm calling. I'm going to be honest about that. You're usually honest when it doesn't cost you anything, she said. Her voice came out level, not cruel, just accurate. Question is what you're honest about when it does. Pause. I told them the truth about you, he said. About your access. About what you knew and didn't know. I want you to know that directly. I know you did. Patterson told me. Then you know I could have, yes, she said. I know you could have. The line was quiet for a moment. I'm not calling to ask for anything, he said. I need you to know that. I'm not calling to ask you to withdraw the filing or come back or... He stopped again. I've spent this week being honest with federal investigators about the worst parts of what I built and why I built it and who it damaged. And the honest answer to all of it, Vivienne, the thing I couldn't get through a single session without arriving at, is that you were the real thing I destroyed. The money, the structure, the organization, those are the consequences. You were the actual damage. She stood very still in the atelier. The painting was in front of her, the Madonna with the crack through her robe, the blue that someone had tried and failed to protect. Lucian, she said. I'm not asking for anything, he said again. I heard you. She held the phone and looked at the painting and felt something in her chest that was not forgiveness. She was honest enough to know. It was not that, not yet, possibly not ever in the form he might want it to take, but was something real. The specific human ache of a thing that had been real being acknowledged as real, finally, without defensive framing or strategic vocabulary. I hear you. That's all, he said quietly. That's not nothing, she said. But it's not enough to change anything. I know it isn't. Then why call? The question sat between them on the line. Because you deserved to hear it, he said. Because I owed you that regardless of whether it changes anything. A pause. And because I think you're the only person who would understand the difference between saying something because it's useful and saying something because it's true. And I needed to say something true to someone who could tell the difference. She looked at the painting. She thought about the crack, about the structure beneath it that had failed before the surface expressed it, about the seam that had held until the differential became too great. I'm going to hang up now, she said. All right. Lucian. She hesitated, not from uncertainty, from the specific care of someone who understood that the next thing they said was the actual thing, the one that could not be taken back. What you did, the way you built it, the way you used people, that's not something a phone call repairs. You know that. Yes. But what you're doing now, cooperating, telling the truth even when it cost you, that's the first thing I've seen from you that looks like a real decision. She paused. Not a strategy. A decision. He didn't say anything. He said, not to us. There is no us. But it matters what a person does when they understand what they've done. She looked at the painting. I hope you keep making that kind of decision. She ended the call. She set the phone down on the work table. She picked up her tool. She went back to work. Outside, Florence was settling into its Thursday night, the sounds of it reaching her through the high windows, muffled and distant and completely indifferent, the city going on in all its layered, complicated life around the small lit room where a woman worked steadily on something damaged, finding the original beneath the injury, choosing, with every careful movement, what to preserve and what to let go. The crack was not going to disappear. She wasn't trying to make it disappear. She was making sure it could never grow. The panel painting took 6 weeks. Vivienne had not expected 6 weeks. She had looked at the crack on the first day and calculated 3, possibly 4, accounting for the stabilization process and the careful work of consolidating the flaking paint around the seam before anything else could be addressed. But restoration had a way of revealing itself incrementally. You solved one problem, and the solution showed you 2 more that had been waiting underneath, patient and invisible, for someone to look closely enough. The seam in the underlying panel had a secondary fault she hadn't identified in the preliminary assessment. It ran perpendicular to the main crack, hidden under a layer of old overpaint that a previous restorer had applied sometime in the 19th century. Not maliciously, just with the limited understanding of the period, covering what they couldn't fix with what they had available. She had spent 3 days removing that overpaint carefully, revealing the older damage beneath, and then sat with what she found for a full afternoon before she decided how to proceed. Clara had come and stood beside her and looked at it without speaking for several minutes. Previous restorer made it worse, Vivienne said. Previous restorer did what they could with what they knew, Clara said. The damage they caused was real. It's also not the damage you're addressing. Vivienne had thought about that for days afterward. October came in slowly, the way Florence handled seasonal transitions, not dramatically, not with the sudden cold that Boston deployed like a statement, but with a gradual softening of the light and a particular quality of early morning air that was neither summer nor winter, but something precise and specific to this city and this latitude and this time of year. She walked to the atelier every morning at 7:30, and she walked home every evening at 7 or later, and the city was the same city every day, and she was not the same person, which was the important thing. She had spoken to her daughter twice. Nadia was 31 and lived in Seattle and had inherited her quality of stillness without quite inheriting her mother's patience, which meant she processed difficult information quickly and with visible effort and came out the other side with a precision that sometimes felt abrupt but was actually just honest. When Vivienne called the first time 10 days after Florence, when the federal positioning was beginning to clarify and she could speak about the situation without needing to protect Nadia from the unresolved parts of it, Nadia had listened for 20 minutes without interrupting. Then she said, "You're okay." It wasn't a question. "Working on it," Vivienne said, which was what she'd told Elise, which was she was beginning to understand the most accurate possible answer to that particular question. He knew what he was doing, Nadia said. Not angrily, just as information, stated the way her mother stated things she had assessed and accepted. When he married you, he knew. A pause. And you didn't. I knew things didn't always fit. I didn't know what the things that didn't fit were telling me. That's not the same as being naive, Mom. No, Vivienne agreed. It's not. The second call was 3 weeks later, after Gideon's situation had resolved into a formal cooperation agreement that his attorneys had negotiated with the speed of a man who understood his alternatives clearly. Nadia asked how the painting was going. Vivienne told her about the secondary fault, the 19th century overpaint, the decision about how to proceed. Nadia listened to the technical details with the focused interest of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, which was the quality in her daughter that Vivienne loved most specifically, not intelligence, which was common enough, but the desire to actually follow something all the way through to its logic. "What did you decide?" Nadia asked. "About how to proceed." "Stabilize the structure," Vivienne said. "Consolidate what's there. Address the active damage without trying to reverse every previous decision. Painting has a history now. You don't erase the history, you manage it." "You're not just talking about the painting," Nadia said. "I'm also talking about the painting," Vivienne said. Nadia laughed, short, genuine. "I want to come see you." "Come in November," Vivienne said. "The light in November is come in November." The federal process moved at its own pace, which was geological by the standards of anyone expecting resolution in weeks. Patterson called, with updates when there were updates, and with silence when there wasn't. And Vivian had learned to trust the silence as much as the calls because Patterson was a woman who understood that unnecessary communication was its own kind of distortion. The sealed filing had been formally integrated into the broader federal investigation in late October. Her role was documented as a cooperating witness who had provided independent documentation, independent being the operative word, established cleanly through the timeline work Mara had done and the video session with Solis and Chen, and the complete absence of any actual coordination with Gideon's process. Solis had called her once more in early November with a single follow-up question about the specific account she had accessed on the fourth night in the suite. She answered it in 4 sentences. He thanked her. She had not heard from federal investigators again. Gideon's cooperation was, by all accounts Patterson had access to, extensive. He had given them 18 months of documentation and the organizational knowledge of a man who had been present for every significant decision in Lucian Vale's empire for nearly 2 decades. He was thorough and detailed, and Patterson said with a specific dryness, entirely unsentimental about who he implicated. He had structured his cooperation the way he structured everything, to maximize his own outcome, calibrated to give exactly what was necessary to secure the deal he wanted, and nothing beyond it. 3 of Lucian's associates were formally charged in November. 2 more were under investigation. The holding companies named in the civil complaint were in the process of being dissolved or restructured under federal supervision. The financial exposure was significant, not catastrophic in the sense that would have destroyed a man of fewer resources, but significant in the sense that the empire Lucian had spent 20 years building was now considerably smaller and considerably more visible than it had been, and would remain that way for whatever came next. Vivian read the coverage when it appeared in the financial press briefly, once, enough to understand the shape of what had happened, and then she put her phone away and went back to the painting. She did not read it twice. Lucian came to Florence in late November. She had not expected him. She had thought about whether he might come. The thought had occurred to her, obliquely, in the way that unresolved things occurred to her in the early mornings, before she was fully awake, but she had not predicted it with any confidence. Because the Lucian Vale she had known for 2 years was not a man who did things without a clear outcome in mind, and coming to Florence had no clear outcome. She was outside the atelier when he arrived. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the light already going flat at 4 o'clock, the way November light did, and she had come out to get air after 3 hours of close work and was standing on the narrow cobblestone street, with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes on the rooftops when she heard footsteps that she recognized before she understood why. She recognized them, a specific rhythm, slightly deliberate, the walk of a man accustomed to entering rooms. She turned. He was across the street, maybe 20 feet. He looked like himself, and also like a version of himself that had been through something. Not diminished, exactly, but reduced to essentials in the way that difficult experiences reduced people, the unnecessary layers stripped away, the performance of himself absent. He wore a coat she hadn't seen before, and he was alone, no one with him, no phone in his hand. They looked at each other. He didn't move toward her immediately. She didn't move at all. I almost didn't come, he said. His voice carried fine across the narrow street. I had the trip booked 3 times and canceled it twice. What changed the 3rd time, she said. I stopped trying to figure out what I wanted from it. He paused. Every time I planned what I was going to say, I heard how it sounded, and I canceled. When I stopped planning, I got on the plane. She looked at him. I'm not here to ask for anything, he said. You said that on the phone. I know, I'm saying it. Again, because I mean it, and because I think you need to hear it more than once from me before you believe it. He shifted his weight slightly, not nervously, more the way a person shifted when they were choosing to stay somewhere rather than leave. You were right about what you said, on the phone. That what I'm doing now, cooperating, telling the truth, that it's not a strategy. He paused. It's genuinely not. I want you to know that. I believed you when you said it, she said. That hasn't changed. He nodded. The November light was the particular gray of late afternoon in a city that understood how to wear its own history without pretending it was anything else, and it made both of them look like themselves, neither softened nor harsh, just present. I owe you an accounting, he said. Not an apology. I know the word doesn't do anything useful, but an accounting of what I actually did. She said nothing, not because she was refusing, because she was listening. I knew you loved me, he said. I knew it from the first 6 months, maybe earlier. I knew it was real, and I used it as a feature rather than he stopped. The language I used in that message, strategy. I used that word about a person who gave me something real, and I used it to reassure someone else who was also giving me something real. And the truth is that the word says more about how I understood people than it does about either of you specifically. He looked at her directly. I understood people as positions, as resources, as things that were more or less useful to what I was building. I was not incapable of warmth. I think you know that. But warmth was something I deployed rather than felt most of the time. With you, it was occasionally real. That's the part that's hardest to say, because it's the most damning. The street was quiet. A scooter passed at the far end, and then quiet again. Occasionally real, she repeated. Yes, she heard the honesty in it. That was the thing about Lucian, when he was actually honest. It didn't sound like the performed version. It didn't have the smooth quality of a prepared statement. It had the slightly uneven quality of someone saying something they had arrived at through difficulty rather than construction. The Vermont weekend, she said. When you said, I was the first person in 30 years who made you feel like you didn't have to perform. That was real, he said. That specific moment was real. And then you went home and sent her a message. He didn't look away. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. The accounting was what it was. Not sufficient, not repairing, not the beginning of anything she could identify as reconciliation. But it was specific and it was honest, and it addressed the actual things rather than the comfortable adjacent things. And she had understood for some time, now that the accounting was the only thing she had ever actually needed from him. Not return, not reversal, not the impossible rewind. Just the truth about what had happened, stated by the person who had done it, without defensive architecture around it. I loved you, she said. That's important for you to hear from me directly. I loved you completely and without reservation, and I was not performing, and I was not strategizing. What I gave you was the real thing. I know, he said. That's the part I have to live with. Yes, she said. It is. The light was going. The sky over the rooftops was moving from gray into the particular deep blue that preceded Florence's early winter dark, and the street lamps were beginning to feel necessary rather than decorative. What happens to you now, she said, not asked with investment in the answer, asked the way she would ask anyone she had known closely, with the acknowledgement that the answer mattered to them, even if it no longer shaped her own. The empire's smaller, he said, significantly. The restructuring it's going to take years. Several people I trusted are either cooperating with investigators or facing charges, and the ones who aren't are keeping their distance. He paused. Matteo won't see me. I understand why. Will the business survive? Some of it. The legitimate structure's real estate, the consulting entities, those can survive if I manage them carefully and transparently and stop using them as cover for things they were never supposed to be. He said it without self-pity, which she noted. It's a different kind of work. I don't know yet if I'm capable of it. That's an honest answer. I've been practicing. A brief pause that was almost not quite wry. She looked at him across the narrow cobblestone street and felt the specific, irreducible complexity of what she was feeling. Not love, not anymore, not in the form it had taken, but something that shared territory with it. The recognition of a person she had known, in a way that had cost her something real. The acknowledgement of that cost without the need to keep paying it. I'm not coming back, she said. I know, and I'm not withdrawing anything. The documentation stands. What I gave Patterson stands. I know that too. He met her eyes. I'm not asking you to. Then I want you to understand something, she said. What you've done in the past 2 months, cooperating, telling the truth even when it cost you, coming here without an agenda, that's not nothing. It doesn't repair what happened. It doesn't give me back 2 years, or the specific grief of loving someone who was calculating it. She paused, choosing the rest of what she was going to say with the care she brought to everything she handled. But it's real. And real things matter even when they arrive too late to change the outcome. He received that without reaching for it, which was the right response. I'm going back in, she said. There's work that needs another hour before the light is completely gone. He nodded. She turned back toward the atelier door. Vivienne. His voice was quiet, and she heard in it something she had not heard before. Not the usual confidence. Not the performance of the man who entered rooms, just a person at the end of something. Standing in a foreign city at the beginning of an early winter night. holding the full weight of what he'd done without putting it down. Stopped, but didn't turn. "Thank you for telling me it was real," he said. "What you felt." She stood still for a moment. "It was real," she said. "You just didn't treat it that way." She went inside. He left Florence the next morning. She knew because Clara mentioned seeing a man fitting his description, walking toward the train station at 8 a.m. Clara had her own sources, the accumulated civic intelligence of 22 years in the same neighborhood, and Vivian said only yes and went back to what she was doing. She was not watching the train station. She was working. Nadia arrived the second week of November on a Thursday, with a bag that was too small for the length of time she was staying, which was characteristic. She stood in the doorway of the atelier with the same quality of assessment her mother brought to damaged things. Unhurried, direct, taking the full measure of the room before she said anything. "Smells like your work," she said. "It smells like the work," Vivian said. "That's the same thing right now." Nadia looked at the panel painting on the work table. She didn't touch it. She had learned that early as a child in her mother's previous studio, that you looked before you touched and sometimes you only looked. "Is that the one you were telling me about?" "That's it." Nadia studied the crack still visible, still present, but stabilized now, the paint around it consolidated, the structure beneath secured against further movement. "You can still see it. You'll always be able to see it," Vivian said. "That's not the failure. The failure would be if it got worse." Nadia looked at her. "Mom, I know," Vivianson said. They went to dinner at a restaurant 3 streets from the atelier that Clara had recommended, a small place with uneven tables and a menu that changed with the market and a quality of noise that was convivial rather than overwhelming. They ordered what the server suggested and drank the wine that came with it, and talked about Nadia's work and her apartment and a person she had been seeing for 4 months whose name was Pav, and about whom she spoke with a specific careful quality that Vivian recognized as the language of someone who was trying not to like something too much until they were sure it was safe to. "I'm not going to tell you to be careful," Vivian said. Nadia looked at her. "What are you going to tell me?" "Nothing." She held her wine glass. "I'm going to tell you that you know things I didn't know at your age, and that knowing them doesn't protect you from everything, but it's not nothing." She paused. "And I'm going to tell you that being wrong about someone doesn't mean you were wrong to love them. Those are 2 different kinds of wrong." Nadia was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" she said. The same phrasing as the first call. Not a question, an assessment seeking confirmation. "Getting there," Vivian said, "which is different from working on it. Getting there implies direction." Nadia reached across the table and covered her mother's hand with her own for a moment. Not dramatically, not with the weight of something that needed to be felt for a long time, just the brief, specific pressure of acknowledgement, and then reached back for her wine. They stayed until the restaurant began to close around them, neither of them rushing, both of them comfortable with the quality of the evening and the accumulation of ordinary conversation that was actually extraordinary because of who was having it and what had preceded it. December settled over Florence with the particular self-assurance of a city that understood winter as an aesthetic rather than an inconvenience. The panel painting was finished on the 14th. Vivian stood in front of it for a long time that morning, not assessing, not looking for anything she had missed, just looking at the thing that had occupied her hands and attention for 6 weeks. Crack was there. The secondary fault was there, addressed and stable, no longer a threat. The 19th century overpaint was gone, revealing the older surface beneath not perfect, not as it had originally been, but honest. The damage was visible and managed, and it had not changed the essential nature of the thing. Clara came and stood beside her. They stood there for 2 or 3 minutes without speaking, which was the appropriate response to something that had been worked on carefully, and had arrived at the place where work became completion. "Good," Clara said finally. "That was enough." Mara called the week before Christmas. The federal investigation had produced its first formal indictments, 3 names, none of them Lucian's. He remained a cooperating witness, his testimony central to the cases being built, his own position managed through Vincent Hale, with the methodical care of a man who had decided that survival on diminished terms was preferable to destruction on his own. "His exposure is reduced but not eliminated," Marissa said. "He's going to carry the consequences of this for years. Civil liability, ongoing federal oversight of his remaining entities, The reputational damage. She paused. But he's going to be all right in the basic sense. He's not going to prison. I didn't want him to go to prison, Vivienne said. I know. I wanted the structures he built to be accountable. I wanted the people who were using those structures to be accountable. She paused. He was accountable when it mattered. He told the truth when the truth cost him. Cost him a great deal, Mara confirmed. Yes. She looked out the atelier window at the December afternoon. The right price. And Gideon. Gideon had pled to a reduced charge in exchange for his cooperation, a deal that reflected the value of what he'd provided, and the legal reality that his 18 months of documentation had been essential to the investigation's scope. He would serve time. Not what he would have served without the deal, but time. He had accepted it with the composure of a man who had calculated the outcome and found it within his acceptable parameters. Vivienne had no particular feeling about Gideon. She had thought she might, that the specific anger of being used as cover for someone else's agenda might settle into something that required ongoing attention. Gideon had been operating with his own logic toward his own ends, and his use of her exit as distraction had not actually compromised what she'd done. The documentation had stood. Her position had been established as independent. Whatever he had calculated about her role in his plan, the calculation had not played out the way he'd intended. She had been a move he made. The move had not benefited him the way he'd expected. That was sufficient. Serena, Vivienne said. She cooperated with investigators in a limited capacity, Mara said. Background only. She didn't have the kind of documentation access that made her testimony central. But she told the truth about what she knew and the timeline of her relationship with Lucien, and that truth corroborated several key elements of the broader picture. A pause. She's out of his orbit. Has been since October. Vivienne thought about Serena's first message. I had no idea he was getting married, and the 4-year thread of conversations she had read on the tablet, in the bridal suite, the specific quality of someone who believed they were the real thing. She had thought of Serena occasionally since then. Not with hostility. The hostility had never fully arrived, which had surprised her, but with the particular recognition of someone who had been deceived by the same person in a different direction. I hope she's all right, Vivienne said. I think she will be, Mara said, given time. After the call, Vivienne sat at the small desk in the atelier office and wrote a brief message to Serena's number, which she still had never deleted. I heard you cooperated. I wanted you to know I think that took something. I hope the next year is better than the last one. She sent it. The response came 2 hours later. Thank you for saying that. I think we both deserved better. I hope Florence is treating you well. Vivienne looked at the message. She typed, "It is." She sent that too, and meant it, and put the phone away. The new year came. Florence celebrated it with fireworks over the Arno that Vivienne watched from the roof of Clara's building, with Clara and 2 other restorers from the atelier and a bottle of wine that was better than the occasion strictly required. Fireworks were vivid and brief, and reflected in the river below in a way that doubled them, the real and the reflection equally present, equally fleeting. She thought about the Fairmont suite. She thought about the champagne that had gone flat, and the roses that had leaned, and the tablet glowing on the nightstand, and the 4 words she had written on a notepad, and the ring she had placed in an envelope. She thought about Mara's voice at 1 a.m., precise and unhurried. She thought about Elise in the rental car, driving without talking, which was the purest form of care she knew. She thought about the painting, the crack that was still there, stable and visible, managed but present. She thought about Lucien in the narrow Florence street, his coat she hadn't seen before, his voice without its usual resonance, his hands in his pockets. I stopped trying to figure out what I wanted from it. She thought about what it had cost him to say the things he'd said, not because they were difficult words, but because he was a man who had spent 30 years not saying them, and the muscle for it had atrophied, and using it had required something she was willing to acknowledge, even if she could not give him anything in return for it. She thought about being 51 years old and standing at an altar in an ivory silk dress and telling herself stories about the pauses and the absences and the things that didn't quite fit, and she felt grief for that woman, clean, honest grief. Not the kind that required anything from anyone, just the acknowledgement of what it had cost to love badly. Then the fireworks ended and Clara refilled her glass and said something dry about the quality of Florentine celebrations that made everyone laugh. and the roof was cold, and the wine was warm, and the year turned without ceremony into the thing that came next. January brought new work. A Flemish panel from a private collector, significantly damaged, with a cleaning history that had been aggressive in the wrong places. A small portrait from a museum loan needing stabilization and documentation. An inquiry from a German conservator about a collaboration on a large format canvas that would take the better part of the following year. She said yes to all of it. Her hands knew what to do. They had always known that was the thing she had not lost, through any of it, the very specific competence that lived in her hands and her eyes, and the patient attention she brought to damaged things. She had thought, in the worst moments in Boston, that she might come out of it diminished. That the specific quality of exhaustion she was carrying might leave a mark on the work. It hadn't. If anything, the work was clearer. She thought about why, one morning in early February, standing in front of the Flemish panel with a light source she was adjusting to reveal the underdrawing beneath the paint layer. She thought about what damage did to the people who spent time with it, not the damage itself, but the attention the damage required. Stained, unhurried, rigorous attention. It made you better at looking. It made you better at knowing the difference between what was original and what was added afterward, and what was corrupted and what was essential and what could be lost without losing the whole. She adjusted the light. The underdrawing appeared. The artist's original intention, visible now beneath everything that had been applied over it, faint but present and completely legible. She reached for her notebook and began to write down what she saw. Outside, Florence was doing its February thing, cold and somewhat gray and completely indifferent to being anything other than what it was, and the light through the north skylights was the flat, consistent, honest light that showed things as they were, and she stood in it and worked, and the morning moved around her in the way that morning was moved when you were where you were supposed to be and doing what your hands understood. She did not look at the time. She did not think about Boston. She thought about the painting. The painting was enough.